My name is Lena Tran. I'm 34, and I thought the hardest part of motherhood was balancing work and love. But nothing prepares you for the moment you find your daughter on the kitchen floor scrubbing grout with a toothbrush, her small fingers raw and shaking. Sophie is 8. She's not my biological child, she's my heart. I adopted her after my sister died, raised her with every ounce of devotion I had. And for years I believed my in-laws saw her the same way my husband Nathan and I did as family. I was wrong. And the day I came home early from a business trip unannounced, everything I thought I knew about family shattered. Thursday afternoon. I came home earlier than expected. My business trip to Seattle ended abruptly when the client canceled the final meeting, leaving me with a rescheduled flight and a strange sense of relief. I hadn't told anyone. I wanted to surprise my daughter. Maybe sneak up and hug her while she was coloring or take her out for ice cream before dinner, the kind of spontaneous, quiet mother-daughter moment we rarely got. When I opened the front gate, the house was unsettlingly quiet. No TV, no voices, not even the sound of footsteps. I called out, "Sophie, Mommy's home." No answer. Still carrying my luggage, I walked quickly into the kitchen, and then I saw her. Sophie was kneeling on the white tile floor. She wore her light pink sweater, the sleeves soaked through. Her small hands gripped a toothbrush, scrubbing at a stubborn stain in the corner by the fridge. Sweat beaded on her forehead, her messy hair clinging to her neck. A bucket of murky water sat beside her, reeking of soap and old metal. I froze. "Sophie, what are you doing?" She flinched, the toothbrush clattering to the floor. She turned to me, wide-eyed lips trembling. And as if afraid she'd be scolded for stopping, she whispered, "I spilled tomato soup this morning. Grandma said I have to scrub until I can see my reflection in the tile." My heart clenched. "Where's Grandma?" I knelt down and reached for the towel by the sink to wipe her hands. "She went out, with Aunt Rachel and Emily, to a spa or something. They said I didn't need to come because that place isn't for kids who don't know how to keep up appearances." I said nothing for a few seconds, not because I didn't want to, but because I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Sophie, how long have you been home alone?" "Since breakfast," she said softly. "After I spilled the soup, Grandma said I couldn't leave the house. I had to clean the whole kitchen before they got back. If not, no dinner." I glanced around. The kitchen clock read 4:17 p.m., which meant my daughter had been alone in the house for over 6 hours, with a bucket, a toothbrush, and the promise that if she didn't clean well enough, she wouldn't get to eat. No child deserves that, especially not an 8-year-old, especially not my daughter. I pulled her into my arms, feeling her little body shivering against mine. "It's okay now, baby. Mommy's here. You don't have to scrub anything anymore, all right?" Sophie nodded quietly. And that's when I realized her eyes weren't just wet from sweat. Some cracks make no sound when they appear. They just spread quietly, invisibly, until one day the whole roof caves in and you realize something had been wrong for a very long time. Sophie isn't my biological daughter, but she is the best decision I've ever made. 10 years ago, I was a 24-year-old single woman with a steady job and a simple, quiet future ahead of me. When the call came from the hospital telling me my younger sister Sarah and her husband had died in a car accident, I stopped being who I was. I became the only person left on Earth that their child could call mom. Sophie was only 18 months old then, a little girl with messy brown curls and eyes that always looked a little too wet. She didn't cry much, she just stared. That kind of stare children have when the world has gone quiet in a way they don't understand. I adopted her almost immediately, not because I knew I was ready, but because I knew she deserved someone who would love her without conditions. It took time for both of us. I had to learn how to sing the songs Sarah used to hum at bedtime, learn how to tell the difference between a hunger cry and a grief cry. I rebuilt my entire life not out of obligation, but because Sophie deserved one worth living. Then came Nathan. We met at a digital media conference. We sat next to each other laughing at a poorly delivered keynote. He was the kind of man who truly listened, and the way his eyes softened when he first saw Sophie, I just knew. This was someone who could love her as his own. 1 year later, Nathan proposed. But what made me cry wasn't the ring in his palm, it was the moment he knelt down in front of Sophie, handed her a tiny heart-shaped necklace, and said, "I didn't get to be there when you were born, but I choose to be here now. If you'll let me, I'd be honored to be your dad." I thought at that moment our family was complete, until I met his mother, Diana Harper. She shook my hand with the perfect smile. Her words were warm, her tone polite. But when she turned to look at Sophie, she hesitated just for a beat, just long enough for me to feel the first ripple. Diana was the kind of woman who lived by heritage, by lineage, by family trees, framed in gold and holiday cards organized by blood. And although Nathan had legally adopted Sophie, there was no place for her photo on Diana's mantle. At first, the signs were small, a family photo sent in the group chat with Sophie cropped out of frame. A birthday party cake that read, "Only Happy Birthday, Emily being Diana's biological granddaughter Sophie's age. Sophie's name appeared on a smaller cake tucked in the corner. It simply said, "Little S." I used to pretend I didn't notice. I told myself maybe they just forgot. Maybe I'm overthinking. Until one afternoon I overheard Diana speaking to a friend during a tea gathering at her house. "She's sweet, but she's not really a Harper. We care for her, of course, but she's someone else's child." Someone else's child. I don't remember exactly how I reacted to hearing that. Maybe I just smiled politely, kept my posture straight, and stayed quiet. Maybe I said nothing like I had so many times before. Sophie never said a word about it. But like all children, she learned to read the truth without language. She learned how to fall silent when overlooked, learned to smile when compared, learned to stand behind others because that's where she was always gently placed. I used to think I could balance it all, that if Nathan and I loved her hard enough, everything else would eventually come around. I was wrong. Some gaps can't be filled with love alone, especially when respect was never there to begin with. The business trip to Chicago was originally supposed to be just one final meeting over the weekend, nothing urgent. I had already declined it twice, but this time my manager sent an email with a subject line I couldn't ignore, client confirmed. "You're essential." Which meant I didn't have a choice. Nathan understood like he always did. As I packed my suitcase, he wrapped his arms around me from behind and said gently, "I'll handle it. Let's ask Mom to watch Sophie. She's been asking when she could have some one-on-one time with her anyway." I hesitated. There was a heaviness in my chest I couldn't quite name. Not because I didn't believe Diana could technically take care of Sophie, but because I hadn't forgotten the way she looked whenever Sophie called Nathan Dad. I could ask my mom, I suggested. She's always happy to. "Your mom just had knee surgery." Nathan reminded me, his hand resting on my shoulder. "My mom will be fine. This could be a good thing, a chance, for her to connect with Sophie, for Sophie to see that Grandma cares. She just shows it in her own way." I nodded, just once, and it would become the one decision I'd regret longer than almost anything else. That morning, Diana arrived early with her overnight bag slung over her shoulder like she was heading to a weekend retreat. "It's only 2 days," she said breezily as I ran through a careful list of reminders. "We raised 2 boys. 1 little girl won't be a challenge." I knelt to hug Sophie. "I'll call every night, okay? Just tell me everything you did that day." "Okay," she nodded, squeezing me tightly. "Come home soon, Mommy. I love you," I whispered. "I love you more than the sky," Sophie replied like always, but this time there was something different in her eyes, something she didn't have words for yet. My first day in Chicago passed in a blur of back-to-back meetings, but I made time that night to FaceTime Sophie. Diana answered. "She's doing dishes," she said, holding the phone like it was an interruption. "She'll call you back later." But Sophie didn't call back. I told myself maybe she was tired. Maybe she was in the bath. It's okay. On the second night I called earlier. This time Sophie answered, but only for a short minute. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" "Yes, I'm okay. What did you do today?" Grandma told me to clean the stairs because Emily made a mess with cake. But I didn't make the mess. "Did you have dinner?" "Yes, sandwich." "What did Grandma and Emily eat?" She hesitated. "Roast chicken and potatoes. I think it was a special dinner just for them." My chest sank. "Sweetheart, mommy's coming home soon, okay?" "Okay," she smiled, faintly. "Don't worry about me, mommy." After that call, I couldn't sleep. On the third night I called again, but the phone rang until it went to voicemail. I tried texting. No reply. Near midnight, I finally received a short message from Diana. "Sophie's asleep. She was tired from cleaning all afternoon. Good night." No photo, no voice note, no "love you mom" from Sophie, nothing to ease my nerves. Something inside me snapped then, a mother's instinct, quiet but undeniable. She's not okay. And I was wrong to leave her. The next morning, the client surprised us by signing the contract early. While the rest of my team cheered, I quietly called the airline and changed my flight. I didn't tell Nathan. I didn't alert Diana. I needed to return quietly. I needed to see it all with my own eyes. The cab dropped me off on a damp afternoon, the sky overcast and gray, matching the unease that had lodged in my chest since the day I left. The house looked just like the morning I'd said goodbye. Still, silent. I opened the front door. And I didn't know that just a few steps later, I would see something that would make me question how I ever forgave myself. I never thought my own kitchen could become a place that made my chest go cold. After carrying Sophie away from the tile floor, I brought her upstairs to the bathroom. Under the soft yellow light, I saw the redness on her hands more clearly. Tiny scrapes across her palms, bruises blooming on her knees from kneeling too long on the hard surface. I gently applied lotion to her skin while she sat still like a leaf that had endured too much wind. "Why didn't you call me?" I asked, keeping my voice soft. "I wasn't allowed to use the phone," she replied. "Grandma said only real family gets phone privileges." I held my breath. "Has it been like this the whole time?" Sophie nodded slowly. "It wasn't just scrubbing the floor," she murmured. "I had to fold laundry, do the dishes. Grandma said if I worked quickly I could maybe watch TV with Emily. But I never finished fast enough. Did you tell her you were tired? That you didn't want to do it?" Sophie lowered her head. After a moment, she whispered, "I told her I felt sad, that I missed you, that I felt lonely." And what did she say? She said, "That's because I don't belong here, that this isn't my real home." That sentence landed in my chest like a stone. You don't belong here. I'd spent so many years believing that if I loved Sophie hard enough, consistently enough, it would erase every trace of the bloodline she didn't share. But a child hearing that from the woman she's supposed to call Grandma, no amount of love could shield her from the weight of those words. "What about meals?" I asked, my voice tightening. "Did you eat with them?" "No. I had to eat in the kitchen. Grandma said Emily needed private space to socialize with the grown-ups." I remembered last night's call, me sitting in a hotel room picking at a cold salad, distracted and unsettled. Diana's voice had been calm, even empty. She's already asleep, tired from cleaning all afternoon. Now I finally understood what cleaning meant. Not chores, control, dehumanization. "Did anyone see how you were treated, Aunt Rachel, Emily?" Sophie shook her head. "When people came over, Grandma told me to go to my room. She shut the door and said not to come down until she called me. Once I tried to listen at the top of the stairs. Grandma was laughing really loud, telling a story about how Emily got picked for the school dance team. She said Emily was the pride of the family. Did she ever mention you?" Sophie was quiet. Then softly she said, "I was just a footnote." I turned away briefly, trying to swallow the rage rising in my throat. If Diana had walked into the house in that moment, I don't know if I could have stood still. I knelt down and looked into Sophie's eyes. "Listen to me, sweetheart. Every inch of this house, from the kitchen to the living room, from the front steps to your bedroom, belongs to you. No one gets to say otherwise. Even if I'm not her blood, you are my heart. And your dad's too. There's not a drop of blood in this world more valuable than real love. Do you understand?" She nodded, her eyes filling with tears, but this time they weren't from fear. She leaned into my arms and whispered so quietly I almost didn't hear it, "I just want a place where I'm allowed to be me." "You already have it," I said, holding her close. "Right here, always." A little while later, with clean clothes on and a warm cup of milk in her hands, Sophie curled up with some cookies on the couch. I went back down to the kitchen. I wiped the counter, rinsed out the bucket, folded the cleaning cloth like someone gently closing a painful chapter. I stood in the middle of that kitchen looking around. The late afternoon light slid across the cold, white tiles. The shadows in this house didn't live where the sunlight couldn't reach. They lived where people deliberately turned the lights off so they wouldn't have to see someone they didn't want to see. But I wasn't going to let my daughter live in the dark for one more second. I heard the front door open at exactly 5:42 p.m. The sharp click of Diana's heels echoed on the hardwood floor, followed by Emily's high-pitched laugh and Rachel's cheerful voice. That spa had the best herbal steam room ever, Mom. I didn't step out of the kitchen right away. I waited for their laughter to die down, waited for the sound of shopping bags hitting the table, waited for Emily to ask, "Where's Sophie?" and for Diana to reply, cool as ever, upstairs. Hopefully she finished scrubbing the kitchen. Spilled an entire bowl of soup today. I stepped out just as she took off her sunglasses. "You don't need to hope anymore," I said, "because I'm home." All three of them froze. Emily whispered, "She came back early." Rachel gave an awkward smile. "Oh, Lena, we didn't know exactly. Because I didn't tell anyone. I wanted to see for myself what no one else seems to want to see." I turned to Diana, met her gaze without flinching. "You left Sophie alone in this house for 6 hours. You made her scrub the floor with a toothbrush. You barred her from the living room. You told her she doesn't belong in this house." She shrugged as if I'd just accused her of overcooking the soup. "I didn't abuse her. I taught her how to behave properly. If she spills food, she needs to learn responsibility. She's 8 years old," I said, my voice trembling but even. "And responsibility doesn't mean isolation, starvation, and forced labor." Rachel shifted uncomfortably. Emily looked at the floor. But Diana, she didn't blink. She lifted her chin slightly and said louder this time, almost proudly, "I never saw that girl as my granddaughter. She doesn't carry the Harper name. I have no responsibility for her." The silence was deafening. I heard keys turning in the door, then Nathan's footsteps. He walked in holding his briefcase, clearly exhausted from his emergency flight back. But when he heard what Diana had just said, he stopped cold in the entryway. "What did you just say?" Nathan asked, his voice low and cold. "You heard me," Diana replied, turning toward her son. "She's not our blood. You know that. You've just been playing pretend. But I don't have to." Nathan stared at her as if seeing someone he didn't recognize. "You just rejected my entire family," he said quietly. "You didn't just turn your back on Sophie. You erased me too because I chose her." "Oh, don't be dramatic." Diana scoffed. "I'm just being honest. Family is blood." "No," he said, walking toward me, standing beside me. "Family is a choice. Family is love. Family is protection. It's showing up when it matters. It's never letting a child feel like an outsider in their own home." He turned to me. "How long have you known since this afternoon?" I replied. When I found her kneeling on the kitchen floor, sweating through her shirt for spilling a bowl of soup. Nathan closed his eyes. When he opened them again, he looked straight at his mother. "From now on, you won't be alone with Sophie. No more weekends. No more dinners. Nothing." "You'd do that to your own mother," Diana nearly hissed. "Over a child who isn't even yours?" "It's not because she isn't my blood," Nathan said, his voice steady. "It's because you don't have a heart big enough to love a child like her." Diana stood frozen. There was nothing left to say. Every mask had fallen. I squeezed Nathan's hand, and for the first time in 3 unbearable days, I noticed Sophie standing on the stairs, quietly watching, eyes wide. She didn't say anything, but her face said everything. She had just seen with her own eyes what it looks like when someone finally chooses you out loud without apology. The moment the front door closed behind Diana, Nathan sank into the couch and buried his face in his hands. I had never seen him like that, not angry, but broken. A moment later, he stood up and walked to the staircase where Sophie still stood, her small hands gripping the wooden railing. "Sophie," he said, his voice hoarse. "I'm so sorry." She didn't say anything. But when Nathan knelt down, opening his arms, Sophie ran into them without hesitation. They held each other for a long time, as if trying to mend all the cracks someone else had carved into their bond. "I'll never let you go through something like that again," he whispered. "I promise." The very next day, Nathan called the family lawyer and his accountant. He requested that all joint accounts be separated and any financial ties to his mother be cut. "We can't raise a child with money from someone who sees her as a burden," he told me. "From now on, everything will be clean, clear, and entirely for her." We moved into the little lake house that had once just been a weekend getaway. It wasn't big, but it was warm. And most importantly, it didn't hold shadows of people who made Sophie feel small. But pain doesn't vanish just because you promise to love harder. Sophie began weekly therapy with a child psychologist. During the first few sessions, she barely spoke. She just held her bunny Mr. Fluffy and listened. One afternoon after her 5th session, she turned to me while buckling her seatbelt in the car and asked quietly, "Mommy, if I got to choose a new name, could I have one that really belongs to me?" I turned to her, smiling gently. "You want a new name?" "Yes. I don't want anyone to call me that other kid ever again." So on a quiet Sunday afternoon, we held a name day ceremony in the little garden behind our house. No big crowd, just the 3 of us, a few paper lanterns strung between trees and a wooden table. On the table sat a handmade certificate of love written by me and Nathan. We, Lena Tran and Nathan Harper, voluntarily choose to become Sophie's family. Not by blood, not by name, but by heart. We choose to love, to protect, and to walk beside her unconditionally. Family is not where we're born. It's where we choose to belong. Sophie got to choose her own middle name. She picked Hope. When Nathan read the certificate aloud, I saw Sophie smile, a real smile, the first in weeks. Not the kind that tries to please, but the kind that comes from a child who finally believes she belongs. That night, as I tucked her into bed, Sophie whispered, "Today is kind of like my 2nd birthday, isn't it?" "Yes," I said softly. "The day you chose your own family, and I'm so lucky you chose me." She hugged Mr. Fluffy tightly, her eyes starting to drift closed. "Hope isn't something you get," she murmured. "It's something you make." "Right, Mommy. That's right. Hope," I whispered, kissing her forehead. "And you just created a whole new world." That March, when the trees around the lake were just starting to bud green again, I received a handwritten letter. No return address. The slanted familiar handwriting in deep blue ink. At the bottom, signed simply, "Diana." I sat in the kitchen with the sealed envelope in my hands. Sophie was in her study room coloring a worksheet titled "My Ideal Family" with crayons she kept neatly organized in a wooden box. Nathan was outside hammering the last few planks onto the little wooden playhouse we were building together in the backyard. I opened the letter and read it quietly. "Lena, I'm not writing this letter to apologize because I know I don't yet have the courage to say those words properly. I only hope that someday the girl will be able to forgive. Not because I deserve it, but because she might be happier not carrying the weight of resentment forever. Though I've never said this out loud, Sophie is smart, strong, and quieter than any child I've known. Maybe I was wrong from the beginning to believe that blood is the only thing that makes a family. I hope you all find peace. Diana." I read the last line again. There was no apology, no ownership of what she had done. Only a plea for forgiveness, not for Sophie's sake, but to ease her own conscience. I folded the letter, stepped outside to the back patio, where the brick fire pit still held a gentle warmth from the morning. I said nothing. I lit a match and let the letter burn, watching the blue ink curl into pale smoke and drift up into the spring wind. I kept not a single word of it. A burst of laughter rang out from across the yard. Sophie and Nathan were placing the first shingles on the roof of the little wooden house they'd spent 2 weeks designing and building by hand. The pine boards had been carefully sanded, each nail gently tapped in every floorboard, carrying something personal. Sophie's chosen paint color, Lena's suggestion for the window height, Nathan's hand-drawn framing plan. Not a large house, but the first one we'd ever built where every inch began with love. I stepped back inside, wiped down the new photo frame and placed it carefully on the shelf near the window. Inside was the photo we'd taken that morning beneath a cherry blossom tree, already shedding its petals. Sophie wore a yellow jumpsuit, her hair in pigtails, a wooden hammer in her hand. Nathan stood behind her, one arm draped gently around both of us. I was on her left, streaks of green paint still on my fingers, laughing. None of us were looking at the camera. We were looking at each other, and in that gaze between three people not bound by blood, not bound by name but by heartbeat, that was family. There was no need for anyone else's approval, no ceremony, no permission. This family had existed for a long time, but today, I finally gave it a name. She didn't need anyone's permission to belong to a family. She was the family, the beginning, and the home we all returned to. Not everyone who gives us life knows how to love us right, and not everyone who shares our blood deserves to be called family. Sophie never needed permission to belong. She wasn't the child on the sidelines. She was the heart, the center, the reason a house became a home. Sometimes what we need isn't a shared last name, but a gaze that sees us without conditions. No comparisons, no hesitation. If you were ever the child left behind, if you've ever loved a child not born of your blood, if you've ever had to stand up and say, enough, they deserve better, then this story is for you. Because family isn't always where we're born. Sometimes it's the first place we're finally allowed to be exactly who we are.